What happens when one man tries to watch all of the horror films and sci-fi films of the 1950s? Well, we're about to find out because I'm your host Josh Spiegel and this is the 50s Project. Welcome back to 1956 right now as we go to part 2 of our 3-part look into this year. Now, previously on the 50s Project, almost every single year has been pretty compact. It's either been one episode for an entire year of releases or 2 episodes for an entire year of releases. From this point on, it gets pretty big. 1956 is going to be these 3 episodes, but every year after that is going to be about 5 or 6 episodes long because the number of releases just increases dramatically. But let's go check out to see what the middle of this year has to offer. As we start this leg of the year, we're going to have a bit of deja vu, but I thought it was important to go to April 27th and see the American version of Godzilla, King of the Monsters, which I know I've already done Godzilla with the 54 movies, but this is the US version and is different, as we'll soon see. This one starts with the city of Tokyo already in shambles as a narrator tells us about the troubles it had, and we see Ironside all messed up in the rubble. He says his name is Steve Martin, and he says he used to be a wild and crazy guy, and introduces our Japanese cast of characters like Emiko, and he's found, and she takes care of him. And they intercut the original footage with this stuff. Like, this shot is the Japanese version, and then they cut to this woman, a double, and only show her from the back. He flashes back, and we see the very first scene of the OG version with the boat being destroyed, but then Steve is there to meet with Serizawa, and he gets questioned by the authorities since his plane flew over the area, and he starts to investigate the rash of sinking ships. They show the councils trying to figure out the source of the troubles, and surprisingly, they don't dub it. Instead, they just have someone explaining to Martin what they're saying. And there's more new footage than you'd expect. They watch the island ceremony as it's told to him about the monster that they used to sacrifice young girls to, a monster named Godzilla. That night, though, he's present as the big guy tromps on through, trashing everything. They still splice Martin in with the other footage, dropping in some good old back-of-the-head shots where they can, and I love it because, for the most part, he's just sort of sitting off to the side, watching what happens, and commenting it while smoking his little pipe. Then there's that reveal, and it's the same, except for our Steve watching it all. And later, they have him talking to Serizawa, or just a dude in an eye patch, I guess. But then there's actual stuff with the oxygen destroyer. But once the big G starts his rampage, Burr steps aside, and they let the original clips take over. So, we just covered the original Gojira version of this, but an American company bought the rights to distribute it in the US, which they bought for $25,000. They brought in Burr and used those doubles to integrate him into the action, like a proto Power Rangers, and all of the new stuff was done in 3 days. Of course, in the translation and dubbing, they removed any of the references to the bombing of Japan or the direct references of US testing. They then had a handful of actors come in to dub over the Japanese dialogue with English, and one of the actors hired to do it was none other than James Hong, Lo Pan himself. It was a big hit in the theaters here, making $2 million at the box office, and was the first Japanese feature to be a box office hit here. A funny thing that happened then was that internationally, instead of the original Japanese version getting distribution, this new US style one was what they showed interest in. This version would end up getting the majority of the TV runs, and it wasn't until a recent time that the original Japanese 54 version started being seen more, and overtaking this one in terms of visibility, and has since proven to be the superior take. A direct sequel to this, in a way, would be Godzilla 1985, since it featured the return of Steve Martin. And I gave the OG film a 5, but I can only go 3 here. It's shorter and less dark and way less impactful. It's missing all of the subtext and nihilism that makes the 54 one so great. But let's face it, it's still a fun ride to go on. I just would so much rather watch the original. Its cultural significance is a 5 though, just like the original, because not only did it help introduce the big guy to the world, it made him even bigger. And this is where the King of the Monsters moniker comes from. That wasn't a thing in the Japanese one. They adopted calling him that after it was given the title here. Should you watch it? Honestly, stick with the Japanese one, but it's also fun to watch this to see them splicing everything in. This next one debuted on June 7th in San Francisco, and I guess had a wider release over the course of June, and it's The Black Sleep. We're told about a drug that makes people seem like they're dead, even if they're not. We meet Dr. Ramsey, and he's imprisoned for murder, but swears that he's innocent, and he's scheduled to be hanged in the morning. His friend, a surgeon played by good old Basil Rathbone, Sherlock Holmes himself, and he gives him some of that drug called the Black Sleep. When they find him and believe him dead, Cadman takes control of the body with the help of a guy named Odo that's not a changeling. They revive Ramsey and tell him that they had to bring him back within 12 hours or the drug effects are permanent, and then he needs his help with his experiments. Also at his estate though is Laurie, and she's being chased by Mungo. And it's Lon Chaney Jr. again, back so soon after the Indestructible Man. Mungo's out of control and only listens to Daphne, the nurse. Seems Mungo was once an esteemed doctor, but a brain condition made him the way he is, and the doc also has a wife who is comatose from a tumor, and his goal is to solve brain issues. But he discovers that Cadman is operating on patients to map their brains, but doing it while they're still alive and under the influence of the Black Sleep. But Laurie turns out to be Mungo's daughter, and she claims that Cadman is damaging brains and is responsible for her father's state, and think about that for a second. His name is Dr. Monroe, and whether the doc damaged him or a disease did it, and he's staying with him, and Cadman is all like, call him Mungo from now on, and they all do. But then Odo uses the drug on a woman in town who claims to know the doc's deeds, and Ramsey is plagued by guilt, and also discovers that Cadman may have had something to do with him being placed on death row in the first place. So, this one was an independent film, and was directed by Reginald LeBorg, and we haven't seen him since the mid-40s with The Mummy's Ghost and Jungle Woman, and he was brought onto this one as a replacement when the original director didn't have any horror-based experience. Later in the film, there's appearances by both Tor Johnson and Bela Lugosi, both of which were working with Ed Wood at the time. However, since Lugosi was in full swing with his drug addiction, he was relegated to a very minor role as a deaf mute. He was unhappy about this and repeatedly asked for some dialogue, and LeBorg did end up allowing him to shoot some, but then left the clips on the cutting room floor. It would end up being Lugosi's final full role, although he'd appear later in Plan 9 from Outer Space, but in clips that were not shot for that film. It was put on a double bill with The Creeping Unknown, which was the title given for the US release of the Quatermass experiment, and was very successful as the double bill pulled in around $1.2 million. But it got some notoriety when a 9-year-old boy died at a screening from a ruptured artery, and his parents sued the studio and the theater for negligence for making the film too frightening. And I'll give this a 3. It's kind of a mess and doesn't really seem to know what to do with itself, but there's always something wild happening and just such a full assortment of genre stars, kind of at their worst, except Rathbone, who gives a strong performance as the Mad Doc. The CS is just a 2 since it's not much known as compared to other horror stories with this kind of lineup, but the sheer number of big players earns this some extra cred. Should you watch it? Yeah, don't sleep on it.
Man will become infected in all this filth.
Look how
always change.
This next one has a bit of a tenuous date since we know that it came out sometime in July in the UK, but later arrived in the US on September 6th, and it's Fire Maidens from Outer Space. And honestly, I wasn't even aware that there were Fire Maidens on Earth, so I'm not sure that distinction is necessary. It has a nuclear scientist on an airplane, and his name is Luther, and he's about to go head up something called Plan 13, which is based around discovering a 13th moon of Jupiter that's mostly hidden by a fog. They realize that it looks like Earth, and their analysis shows that it has a similar atmosphere, and their goal is to go there. After all their preparation, the big day arrives, and the trip is going to take 3 weeks. And again, it's that whole classic space travel where they're all sitting vertically in the ship as opposed to facing forward, which is weird because the rocket is rocket-shaped, so it doesn't make sense with where they'd be looking. Eventually, they make it to Jupiter and have to locate the moon, and when they hit the atmosphere, they go to land. As they do, though, a signal comes across and tells them that they're under their control, but not just their control, their space control.
You are under our space control.
To celebrate their landing, they all light up cigarettes, which I'm sure is great on a ship with limited air supplies, and they get out and start to walk around. No spacesuits, no nothing. They come across a woman being attacked by some kind of beast man, and they rescue her, so she takes them back to her civilization. They say it's Atlantis, and this one guy says he's the only male survivor, and that the women there are all his daughters, and he needs them to help kill the beast. But it seems like they also have other things in mind, since the ladies do a choreographed dance for them, then drug them, and make out with them after they're out cold. But then it seems like Praxis isn't as benevolent of a leader as he makes himself out to be, and the boys have to deal with defeating that monster and escaping New Atlantis to get home. And this is another independent number, and it was both written and directed by Cy Roth, who also produced. He was mostly an assistant director and had done 2 features before this, but this would be the final one as a lead director. It ended up getting some notice for its silliness and overall cheap level of production, and seems like it did okay, and was eventually featured on an episode of MST3K. Weirdly, this film from 1956 talks about discovering a 13th moon around a Jupiter, and almost 20 years later, in 1974, Leda, Jupiter's actual 13th moon, was discovered. No Fire Maidens though, sadly. And this is amusing. It's a 2.5. There's some fun happening, and it's goofy enough to get some laughs from it, but it just feels like things that we've seen dozens of times. Love that absurd monster, though. The significance is just a 1.5 since it's not much known and certainly didn't make any waves at the time, but I'll give it the 0.5 for getting some attention and getting featured on Mystery Science Theater. Should you watch it? Honestly, it's not bad, but you can probably skip it. Here's another one that doesn't have a confirmed release date, but it came out in the US sometime in July, although it played the UK on August 13th, and it's The Werewolf. It opens at a bar, and this guy comes in and appears distressed, and a dude tries to rob him, but he transforms into something frightening and kills him. The authorities try to track him down, but instead they find wolf tracks, but comment that it's walking on 2 legs. They theorize that it may be the work of a werewolf and set out to find him. And meanwhile, Duncan goes to a dock and says that he has no memory of who he is or where he's from. But then we discover that he's not a classic werewolf changed by magic. Instead, there's these 2 mad scientists, and one of them is concerned that in a nuclear age, only mutations will survive, and plans to use his wolf serum to change a select few to carry on the human race. Duncan was one of his subjects, treated after a car crash, but he escaped, and if he tells what he knows, the Doc's plans will be ruined, so they plan to find him and kill him. Turns out that he has a family as well that are looking for him, and we finally get a good look at that werewolf makeup, and I don't know, there's something about the idea that he's wearing a suit that I kind of love. This one was actually from Colombia, and was directed by Fred F. Sears. And he had directed quite a few films before this one, but they were almost entirely westerns. This would be his first dip into the realm of horror and sci-fi, but as we'll soon see, won't be his last. They hired Clay Campbell to do the werewolf effects, and he did the design for the lycanthrope back in 43's The Return of the Vampire, although this one is a step up from that. It's unique in that it's clearly playing into the science fiction and radiation tropes of the 50s, but also tying in that horror element of the werewolf, making this the first science-based lycanthrope out there. Some have regarded it as the starting point for the decade at the moment that things started to shift back into horror. The reviews weren't great though, and it was criticized for its standard plot, but mentioned that it was the first werewolf film in a very long time. And this is decent. It's a 2.5. I agree with those classic reviewers in that it's mostly just stuff we've seen before, although the mad scientist wrinkle is new, but that's not enough to set it apart, really. The significance is just a 2 since it's not as well known as some others, and in regards to werewolf films, it's not much talked about. But it's one of the only of its kind from the era and marked a change for the shape of the genre. Should you watch it? Perhaps. It's a decent little flick, even if it's unremarkable. This next one ran on a limited release on July 1st, although it did have a premiere back on June 12th, and played a double bill with The Werewolf, and it's Earth versus the Flying Saucers. Seems that there's this sudden increase in the sighting of UFOs, and the military takes an aggressive tact towards them, wanting to fire on any unidentified ones that make themselves visible. We then meet Dr. Marvin, and he's played by Hugh Marlowe, and we just saw him in World Without End, and he recently married Carol, and he's driving with her when suddenly one of the saucers just dips in front of their car. Luckily, they recorded it on this handy portable tape recorder, which seems really easy to have with you at all times, just in case you need to record something. Just bust this baby out and start it up. Doc Marvin is actually also in charge of something called Project Skyhook, and they've put a number of satellites up in orbit, but it seems like a bunch of them have come crashing back down. Just then we get word another has fallen and see strange lights in the sky, but they've already committed to sending up the 12th one. As they're nearing launch, a UFO appears and touches down. Several beings walk out and they just start randomly opening fire on them, even though they seemed pretty chill, so they fight back with a disintegrator ray. They destroy most everyone and take the general aboard their ship and explain that they were only defending themselves. And the doc discovers that the message on the tape was sped up and the aliens were trying to communicate. He eventually is able to get aboard their ship, and they reveal that their solar system has been destroyed, and in a show of force display that they're able to just blow up ships, and also that they've essentially lobotomized the general. They want to occupy the planet and give us around 2 months to set up a meeting with the world leaders, so the doc and crew have to figure out a way to halt their invasion. So I mentioned that this was paired up with The Werewolf, and that was appropriate since it was also directed by Fred F. Sears, although this was the film of the pair that got the attention. It was based on a novel called Flying Saucers from Outer Space, which was from 1953, although it was very loosely based, to the point that it was only said to be suggested by it. The film's biggest claim to fame are those effects, and they're by the great Ray Harryhausen, and it was somewhat early on in his career, but as his reputation was beginning to climb. However, he found this film stressful since it required doing stop-motion destruction of buildings, and he swore after this that since it was too complicated, he wouldn't do it anymore, but he also cited this as his least favorite work. Reviews were pretty good, but it was successful, although not tremendously so. But it developed a big following over time and can be seen as inspiring a good amount of flying saucer type media in the future, including Tim Burton's Mars Attacks. And I'll give it a 3. The story is mostly standard stuff and not all exciting, but I'll tell you what, those Harryhausen effects sure do make a difference. Every time the aliens and the ships were involved, the movie really took off. If only they managed to have more of it in there. The significance is also a 3 since it became a bigger name and made an impact, but wasn't a big sensation and certainly didn't establish much in the way of follow-ups. Should you watch it? Yeah, if even only for the stop-motion bits. It seems like the only way that we're going to go get some horror with no sci-fi in this year is to get a horror comedy, because on July 9th, we're looking at Francis in the Haunted House. Who's Francis, you might ask? Well, that'll be apparent soon. It starts with this guy driving up to a castle and a couple of dudes drop a rock on him, and that kills him. However, it's witnessed by this random mule that just happens to be passing through, and when they get in the car and head up to the castle, the mule follows. It sees a woman being murdered. We then meet Prescott, and it's Mickey Rooney again, who we just saw with the Atomic Kid. And get this, he gets a phone call from that mule, because it's Francis the Talking Mule. He reveals himself to Prescott, and it takes a second to convince him that he's the real deal, and also confesses about the murder that he saw. Prescott goes to the police to try to tell what happened, but when they find out what happened, they think he did it, since he seems to know too much about it. They all go back up to the castle to figure out what's going on, and Francis ends up talking to the DA in order to get Prescott off the hook, and they investigate. When they think they've discovered the killer, Prescott takes him to the cops, but someone else has somehow killed him in the car. And once again, our goofy hero is blamed, and it's up to the mule to turn the tables. And if you're not familiar with what's going on here, Francis the Talking Mule was a character that had a whole film series about him that began in 1950 and had one film a year up until 56. This was the 7th and, in fact, final film of the franchise, and was wildly different. All 6 previous entries were directed by Arthur Lubin, the man who did the 43 version of The Phantom of the Opera, and in all 6, Francis was teamed up with a human that he revealed himself to, named Peter, played by Donald O'Connor. However, this one, the 7th film, was instead directed by Charles Lamont, the man responsible for the Abbott and Costello films that we've seen in the 50s. Seems that O'Connor quit the series, and for whatever reason, they also replaced Lubin. But they also swapped out the voice of Francis, replacing Chill Wills with the legendary Paul Frees, mainly due to him asking for a pay increase. In the film, they don't make any mention of the earlier entries, and the absence of the character of Peter is never explained. It was poorly reviewed and called a mishmash of a bunch of earlier films with similar premises, and even though it made money, it did about half the business of the other 6. Since it was clear that interest was waning, and without the crew that seemed to make the concept work, there were no further installments. And this isn't my brand of comedy, so it's a 2.5. I'll confess that I've never seen the other Francis films, and I gather that they're meant to be better than this one, and I sure hope so, because this is mostly stale material. The significance is a 2, since it's a somewhat known franchise, but not for a long time. And it had Rooney, so there's some name value, but it's not something that people stuck with, and most of the relevance comes from the previous 6. Should you watch it? If you're in the mood for a substandard Mr. Ed episode, I guess go ahead. It's okay, it's just not my thing. Here's another big one, because a little later that month, on July 15th, well, that's the day that it conquered the world. We start by getting clearance by meeting Captain Clarence Over, and he's friends and colleagues with Hawk. He and his wife Joan go to visit them, and Tom's wife is Beverly Garland, and we last saw her back in The Rocket Man and The Neanderthal Man, and we're about to start seeing a whole lot more of her as we go on here. Tom tells Paul that he's received some sort of signal from space and swears it's from Venus and that he can understand it, but Paul just hears noise. Claire is freaked out by it all, and the being that's speaking to him says that he's coming to Earth and that he's crashed. We get a glimpse of it with some sort of antenna and lobster claws, and around this same time there's a massive power surge that cuts all the electric power and even cars and planes. And I guess if you turn a plane's power off, it blows up? Then there's these little bat-like things around, and one attacks a cop, and afterwards he acts like he's in a trance. We then have ourselves a rather momentous occasion. You see this guy right here? Well, that's Mr. Futterman himself, Walter Paisley, Dick Miller. Tom says his alien friend is going to save the world and fix everything, and more of those creatures are flying around, attacking, and leaving a strange mark on people's necks, controlling them. Seems like it wants Paul for some special purpose, and he's told that there's only a handful of them left on Venus, and this one has come to Earth. Paul declares that he can stop it, while Tom and Claire's relationship falls apart. But can they compete with a zucchini? So this is another one that was produced by Roger Corman, and he also directed. Shooting was fairly standard until it came to that monster. It was created by Paul Blaisdell, and he had already worked with Corman on his previous features, and it was his idea that since Venus had a greater gravity, that it would be compact and low to the ground, and also likely vegetable-based. Corman loved it, and even though originally it was only meant to be shown in shadow and off to the side, he instead put it front and center. Well, the cast felt like the creature was just too silly looking, too short, and made fun of it on set. Because of it, they all felt like it would flop, and one of the writers even asked to have his name taken off of the credits. But then, it ended up getting some good reviews, and it was a solid success, and it would turn out to be one of the more known films from the era. It had a remake in 1966, although it was retitled Zontar, the Thing from Venus, and was also the subject of a very popular episode of MST3K. And this is a 3.5. It feels like a mixture of several things that had been done, but it does them in a novel way that feels fresh. And it's all a bit silly in a fun way. That monster is really goofy looking, sure, but every time it's on screen, it's a joy. The significance is a 3.5 because it's become well known and gets referenced a bunch, but let's face it, it's not like it was a big influence on the scene, like a bunch of films would copy it, and it didn't establish itself as a name brand for the long run. Should you watch it? Yeah! I mean, look at that little carrot guy.
You learned almost too late that man is a feeling creature. And because of it, the greatest in the universe. And he learned too late for himself that men have to find their own way to make their own mistakes. There can't be any gift of perfection from outside ourselves.
The following week, we have a more pure sci-fi thing as we go to July 21st, and this one is simply called Satellite in the Sky. It's in full color, and we're in the UK, and they've just completed testing on Operation Stardust, a new type of ship that's meant to break the atmosphere. Commander Hayden is all set to operate the flight and says that the two previous pilots had died during the testing process, and they're prepping for the big mission the following day. They unveil the ship, and it's massive, and we meet this crew that's set to head out. However, they all have people around them that are very wary about the amount of danger involved. That includes Jimmy here, who will be the radio operator, and he wants to propose to his girlfriend, but only manages to do it on the phone with her. The morning arrives, and they have one more member added, a meteorologist named Merity, and they get all set up to launch. They take off, and at least they're facing upwards like a rocket would, and they show it shifting from an upright position to a horizontal one, and it looks more like you would think it would. But they reveal after they take off that the whole purpose of the mission is to release a new bomb as a demonstration. But then there's trouble when it turns out that they have a stowaway in the form of a reporter who wants the mission stopped, and things don't go as smoothly as they would have hoped. This one was a British film. It was directed by Paul Dixon, and his jobs were sporadic and ventured more into shorts and TV episodes than films, and this is likely the only thing that could be counted as eligible for coverage here. It was intended as a far more grounded and serious take on the whole space exploration genre, and is officially the UK's first full-color science fiction film. The special effects were handled by Wally Weavers, and he's been in the industry for a while, but later would go on to much bigger things, and he'd work on 2001: A Space Odyssey, Superman, and would rather infamously die halfway through filming 1983's The Keep, where he had most of the concepts for the visuals in his head, so when he passed on, they had to start everything over from scratch. This film didn't get a lot of love since the reviews mostly thought it was uninteresting and bland, although it did well enough with ticket sales. One thing to mention is that Kim Hamilton, the reporter here, should look very familiar since in just a few years, she'd take on a role that would last her a few decades with Miss Moneypenny. And I agree with those reviews, so I'll give it a 2. It's really well made and looks nice and all, but boy oh boy does not much happen. The CS is just a 1.5 since it didn't make much impact and just went away without much fanfare, but it gets some extra push for Lois Maxwell's inclusion and being the first color British sci-fi flick. Should you watch it? I'd say no, there's not much here you haven't already seen. So our final film for this block brings us to an unknown date in August. So we're only about halfway through this calendar, but 2/3 of the way through the movies. And now we have The Beast of Hollow Mountain. This is set in the Old West as a group of cowboys ride through Mexico around an area called Hollow Mountain. The locals say that the mountain is cursed, and there's been a number of disappearances in the area. But oh no! Also, quicksand! And when I was younger, I really thought that having the sand of the quick would be a genuine hazard that I would have to be aware of in my everyday life. Then, this happens.
You're not mad at me, are you? Your father is not a drunkard. He drinks to forget your mommy who is in heaven.
So let me get this straight. This man's wife died. And he's so wrecked by it that he spends all day in a bar, drunk out of his mind, while his kid just waits outside. And this is played for comedy. Well, cowboy Jimmy rolls into town and meets the lovely Sarita, and she's played by Patricia Medina, who we saw not long ago in Phantom of the Rue Morgue. Jimmy butts heads with Enrique, Serena's fiancé, and then their ranch hands leave, so they allow Pancho and Panchito to help them out. He has to deal with some troubles in town, and when he refuses to sell his ranch to Enrique, the stakes are raised, and things between Jimmy and Sarita heat up. But then, Pancho goes into the swamps alone and confronts some sort of massive beast and is killed, which upsets Panchito so much that he goes out to search for him. Well, right about then is when we finally get a look at what's been responsible for the cattle and people vanishing in the area. And it's this awesome stop-motion dinosaur that just picks up some lunch. Panchito comes face to face with it, which leads to a confrontation. So, this was a mixture of the westerns that were popular at the time with some sci-fi monster stuff. And it was by Edward Nasur. And Ismael Rodriguez. Nasur was mostly a producer, and this was his first directing work, and he only did one other film after, but Rodriguez had done a number of films in Mexico, and this was a joint production between the two companies. They talked to King Kong effects guy, Willis O'Brien, since he was one of the first ones out there to bring up doing dinos versus cowboys, but that fell through, and they brought in a different team instead. As it was a joint production with Mexico, there was a Spanish language version shot simultaneously, and it was released there as La Bestia de la Montana. It was also reputable for being the first film to feature stop-motion creatures in widescreen and color. It was also a decent hit, although it never became a massive sensation and didn't quite earn reputation as some of the other giant monster movies did. But it did end up with a following and was featured on Mystery Science Theater 3000. And I'm going to give it a 2.5, and honestly, it should be a 2, because way too much of this film is dull melodrama, but that final act with the dino is top-notch, and if there were more of it, this would be a lot higher. The CS is a 2 since it's not much talked about or known, but did okay in its time, and did represent a bunch of firsts. First mix of cowboys and dinos, first stop-motion feature in color, and first stop-motion in CinemaScope. Should you watch it? Yeah, but you could probably skip the first 45 minutes. So there you have it, the middle chunk of 1956. Kind of a mediocre batch of movies in this particular block, although a couple of solid performers as well too. Nothing that was too terrible here. Like I said, my favorite one was probably It Conquered the World. Love that silly monster, and it's actually a really fun movie to watch as well too. Corman knew what he was doing. Godzilla is a close second, but again, if I'm choosing between the two, I'm going with the original 54 version. Let me know which of these is your favorite down below. I want to hear that. Let me know which of these you've seen, which of these you would now like to see. Tell me that down below in the comments. Also, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up and like it. If you like the channel, subscribe to it and hit that bell to get notified when new videos get posted. And also, check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/movietimelines. And yeah, we're going to keep on going right here. We're going to finish up 1956 very, very soon, right here on the 50s Project.